CW Bio, Mr. Kennedy here again, and this is part 2 of your Chapter 17 notes on the history of the Earth. In this video, we're going to take a trip through geologic time and kind of look at a couple of scientists who came up with some ideas on how life began on this planet. So this trip through geologic time, well, it's really put together through scientists' best guess on, the formations of the Earth and radiometric and relative dating studies and, fossils that have been dug up. We've kind of tried to piece all of these things together into a chronology that help explain like the beginning of the Earth through now. Keep in mind that this is a lot of conjecture. It's a lot of scientists' best guess, right? There's still a lot of work to be done to clearly map out the geologic timeline because, as we talked about in the first video, there's a lot of stuff that, maybe didn't fossilize or maybe it did fossilize and hasn't been discovered yet. Like there's still tons and tons of work to do to fill in gaps, okay? So here's what we kind of think to date, okay? So when we look at the geologic time scale, rather than being based on months or even years, the geologic time scale is divided up into 4 big sections: the Precambrian, Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic eras. We're going to look at the life in each of these eras. An era is a large division in the scale and represents a huge amount of time. Each era is subdivided into periods, and you can find a map of all of this in your textbook. The divisions in the geologic time scale are distinguished more than anything by the organisms that lived during a time period. So that's, how we kind of create a black and white, like cut and dry break from one era to the next or even one period to the next. Looking at the fossil record, looking at rocks, and speculating as to who was alive and what was the climate like, okay? The fossil record indicates that there were several episodes of mass extinction that fall between time divisions. A mass extinction is an event that occurs when lots of organisms disappear from the fossil record, like literally and quite honestly, almost all at once. The geologic time scale begins with the formation of the Earth at about 4.6 billion years ago. Now, depending on the textbook you're reading, even that number is suspect. Some books say it's 4.6, some say it's 4.8, some say it's 5. Why don't we know for sure? Because no one was around with their, iPhone taking pictures when this happened, like the Big Bang or whatever, and there's no fossil evidence, there's no rock that we can dig up and go, eureka, like here's a rock that's 5 billion years old. The Earth's 5 billion years old. Like we can't do that. So it's a guess, right? So let's go through what life was like in these areas or eras, okay? So the oldest fossils are found on Earth are found in what we call Precambrian rock that date to about 3.4 billion years old. Scientists found these fossils in rocks in the desert of Western Australia. And basically, they kind of look like tiny little bubbles in the rock. Bacteria is what they found in these rocks that are classified as photosynthetic cyanobacteria. Okay, so it's thought that the first life forms were single-celled organisms that formed in this rock about 3.4 billion years ago. Scientists have also found some dome-shaped structures called stromatolites in Australia and on other continents. Stromatolites still form today in Australia from mats of cyanobacteria, so the idea is that stromatolites are then evidence of the existence of a photosynthetic organism on Earth during the Precambrian era. So if we found these stromatolites now, and they're in rocks that are 3.4 billion years ago, so connect the dots, okay? The Precambrian era actually accounts for about 87% of the Earth's history. At the beginning of the Precambrian era, we had little more than unicellular prokaryotic cells, and by the end, we had eukaryotes, right? About 1.8 billion years ago, the fossil record shows more eukaryotic organisms living in the primordial soup or ancient seas, if you will, in conjunction with these bacteria. Now, these guys are thought to be the predecessors to all eukaryotic life that we have today. And they would have formed in the ancient oceans along with the bacteria that I mentioned earlier. There's no life on land right now because there's still, really no atmosphere, ultraviolet radiations bombarding the planet, and no real oxygen to speak of. By the end of the Precambrian era, about 540 million years ago, multicellular life is thought to have begun, with things like sponges, jellyfish, and the like diversifying and filling the oceans. Still haven't gotten out on land, right? But, we've got some multicellular life. In the next era, we get to the Paleozoic era, and this lasted 248 million years. Okay, many more animals and plants were present on Earth, and some were preserved even in our fossil record. The Paleozoic era led into and includes the Cambrian period. And during this Cambrian period in the Paleozoic era, like the oceans basically teemed with life. Animals, worms, sea stars, and all kinds of like really cool arthropods are thought to have colonized the oceans. And you can imagine at this time, that cyanobacteria have probably still been working hard in the ancient oceans photosynthesizing. So I bet that the oxygen atmosphere is like starting to form. So maybe soon we'll see some things that crawl out of the ocean and go on land. During the first half of the Paleozoic era, fish, the oldest animals with backbones, appeared in the Earth's water. There's also fossil evidence of ferns and early seed plants existing on land at about 400 million years ago. Now that's interesting. How come the first thing on land wasn't an animal? Well, because there was no oxygen and you can't survive on land without the oxygen. So, like, it makes sense that plants kind of like, bridged the gap to land first. Around the middle of the Paleozoic, four-legged animals such as amphibians appeared on Earth. So, this is the point at which life maybe starts crawling out of the ocean onto land. During the last half of the era, fossil record shows that reptiles appeared and began to flourish on land. All right, some diversity during the Paleozoic era. Well, the largest mass extinction recorded in the fossil record actually marked the end of the Paleozoic era. About 90% of the Earth's marine species and 70% of the land species disappeared at this point. And that led us to the Mesozoic era. The Mesozoic era began at about 248 million years ago, and it's divided into three periods that you're probably more familiar with than any of the others because lots of people watched the movie Jurassic Park. Okay, so fossils from the Triassic period, which is the oldest period, show mammals appeared on Earth during this time. The fossils of mammals indicate that early mammals were small and mouse-like and actually showed up during this Mesozoic era. Okay. In the middle of the Mesozoic era, we have the Jurassic period, hence the name of the movie, right? And this began at about 206 million years ago and is thought of as basically the age of the dinosaur. Recent fossil discoveries support the idea that modern birds may have actually evolved from groups of dinosaurs towards the end of that period. And then another mass extinction occurs. The last period of the Mesozoic, the Cretaceous period, began at 144 million years ago. During this period, many new types of mammals appeared and flowering plants flourished on Earth. The mass extinction, well, this is the one that ended dinosaurs at the end of the Cretaceous period at about 65 million years ago. The most probable explanation that scientists like to use to describe how the dinosaurs ended, a meteor impact. Okay. Changes during the Mesozoic era. Well, during the Mesozoic era, it's also thought that our continents kind of cruised across the surface of the Earth. Remember your video on plate tectonics? So at this point in our Earth's history, like we have things like Gondwana and Pangaea forming and breaking apart. moving our continents to different hemispheres on our globe. And as they move, their climate could change. The further north you get, well, the colder you're going to get. And if you stay around the equator, you're probably hot, right? And that's going to have some impact on the life that can exist on land in these areas, okay? So we get a lot of changes. Early in the Mesozoic era, the continents were merged into one landmass. And during this era, the supercontinent broke up into pieces and drifted apart. That's what our plate tectonics video was all about. So if you don't remember why they're moving or how they're moving, go back and watch that video, okay? That brings us to the last era in our trip through geologic time, the Cenozoic Era. The Cenozoic Era begins at about 65 million years ago. It's the era in which you now live. Mammals flourish, flowering plants dominate. Primates show up at about 75 million years ago and have diversified greatly ever since. Modern humans are thought to have shown up in the fossil record as recently as 200,000 years ago. All right, ladies and gents, so this is a very quick trip through geologic time. I'll be back with part 3 of this video, where we look at some scientists who theorize, speculate, and try to describe the origins of life as they compare spontaneous generation to biogenesis. I'll see you in just a minute.